Hi there, Steve Kaufmann here. I was asked to do a video today, in fact, about the differences between learning Japanese and Chinese. So I always appreciate getting specific requests. It's always nice to respond to, listeners, viewers who are interested in a particular subject. So I thought I would try to look at these differences, both in terms of how I study the two languages, and I'm going to throw Korean in as well, three Asian languages, and what I think are general differences in terms of difficulty and so forth. Remember that I studied Chinese as a full time language student paid for by the Canadian government because I was a diplomat and they were training me to learn Chinese. I had 3 hours in the morning, and then I had lots of hours full time to devote to reading and listening and building up my skill level in Chinese. I lived in Hong Kong, which was not a place where Mandarin Chinese was spoken, so I did not have the benefit of being immersed in the language. In Japan, I studied it entirely on my own, but I had the advantage of living in Japan. Korean, I am studying here in Vancouver, so again, I'm on my own, but I again don't have the language surrounding me. So, if we look at, first of all, as you probably know or may know, I believe that the best way to learn a language is to devote a lot of time to listening and reading and vocabulary accumulation. You can speak whenever you want to start speaking, but until you have a lot of words, it's very difficult to have meaningful conversations. And I like doing things that are meaningful in the language. Now, with Chinese, an immediate problem is that until you have learned enough characters, you cannot read anything very interesting or meaningful in the language. So that makes Chinese quite difficult. I made a special effort to learn the most frequent 1,000 characters. I had flashcards for them. I used to write them out on these checkered, exercise books where I had sort of a primitive spaced repetition system that I've described before, where I would write the character out 7 or 8, 10 times and then put it over, put the meaning or the pronunciation over 3 or 4 columns to the right, pick up another flashcard, do the same thing until I ran into that first character, and I would do that literally every day. That once I had the 1,000 most common characters that I deliberately wrote out longhand to try to learn, thereafter, as I encountered characters in my reading, it was enough to write them out 5, 6, 7, 10 times. Of course, you keep on forgetting, but forgetting, rewriting, relearning, seeing them in context, and eventually they started to stick. With characters, after a while, you start to get used to the different components, the radicals as they're called, so that helps you remember these characters. You get better and better at learning them. When you first start out, it seems like an impossible task to remember, the stroke order and strokes for 10, 12, 13 different strokes for just one character. So the reading, in the case of Chinese, initially a big obstacle, but once you have the characters, it becomes very easy to build vocabulary because different combinations of the characters that you now know correspond to different words, the way we count words in English. So that was with regard to reading. In Japanese, now bear in mind when I studied Chinese, I had to write an exam. So I knew that as it turned out, after less than a year, I would have to be able to translate newspaper editorials from Chinese into English, from English into Chinese, write a diplomatic note. So I had to focus on my writing. With Japanese, I was studying it only in order to be able to use it, and therefore I essentially never wrote it. So as long as I could read it, I was happy. The problem in Japanese is that a lot of the sort of beginner material, the easier reading material, is very heavy to hiragana, and I found it very difficult to read hiragana. The other thing is, because the hiragana is a syllable type system, so I wanted to move to texts that had a lot of characters as soon as possible, like newspapers and stuff like that. But of course, I couldn't understand the newspapers. It was too quick for me if I listened to the radio news or something. So I was stuck with reading a lot of the beginner material. And one of the mysteries for me in language instruction is that people who write textbooks like to provide, children's stories about, I can't remember who, Tarot, who wrote a turtle underneath the ocean, fairy stories about flying carp on whatever festival day. Subjects that I would never read about in English. I have no interest in these subjects whatsoever. And the same is true in Korean. Lots of these, quote, cultural type content items for beginners or children's stories, which are really not of very much interest. So I remember there was a series called Naganuma, where I just read on and on and on in hiragana and found it quite boring. And I was very happy when I was able to get to texts that were of more interest. So in a sense, Japanese is easier to read because it's a phonetic system, but there are two different phonetic systems, and I never enjoyed reading in katakana, and you don't get enough of a dosage of it, at least I didn't, that I'm still not very good at my katakana. And I prefer to read text with a lot of characters, even if at times I pronounce these characters in the Chinese way. I know what the meaning is. So reading-wise, Japanese is probably easier because you only need about 2,000 characters, whereas in Chinese you have only characters to go with, right? The reading of Korean is the easiest of all because it's an alphabet, like we understand an alphabet. But the difficulty with Korean is, just as in Japanese, or perhaps slightly more so, there are a lot of Chinese words that are based on Chinese, and if you read them in the phonetic script, you often don't know what they are. So that presents certain difficulties. So, for Japanese, definitely you should learn the Chinese characters because it makes it a lot easier to read. Reading is a major tool for language learning, for vocabulary accumulation. I don't know how you would accumulate sort of an adult vocabulary in Japanese if you can't read characters and read interesting and meaningful text. Insofar as the sort of word order or grammatical structure of the languages, I think every language is different and you just have to get used to it. When you start out, it feels strange, but probably Chinese is easier. In fact, not probably, certainly Chinese is easier than Japanese or Korean. Easier to us as English speakers or speakers of European languages, because the word order very often is more similar to what we're used to, and in many cases simpler. There are no conjugations or declensions to deal with. It's I go today, I go tomorrow. Very simple. You go, he go, we go, they go. It doesn't change. But there are some specific structures that are peculiar to Chinese, and you just have to get used to them. And they seem strange at first. For example, we use the relative pronoun which, whereas in Chinese they talk about the you ate dinner. The dinner you ate is the you ate dinner. So there's some different orders there that you have to get used to. And it just takes time. So with enough reading and listening, it eventually starts to feel natural. There are more strange to us structures in Japanese, and you have the problem of the different levels of politeness, which to some extent exists in all languages, but is a much bigger deal in Japanese and in Korean. And for a long time, it just seems like you can't get used to that, but eventually you do through enough exposure. Korean right now, I'm experiencing the difficulty that the way the future is constructed is I just can't get my brain tied around it. I've seen the explanations, I've seen examples, and when I speak, I have a lot of difficulty coming up with those structures. But I know from previous experience that with enough exposure, enough listening and reading, eventually these structures will become natural to me. Chinese easier than Japanese or Korean insofar as the structure of the language is concerned. Insofar as pronunciation, I think that Chinese is the most difficult because of the tones. However, the actual sounds themselves, a lot of them are quite similar to English. There are some difficult sounds, but not so many, and it's not surprising that there are quite a few English speakers who are absolutely fluent and flawless speakers of Chinese, such as the famous Da Shan, who is Canadian, who is a personality on TV in China. But I think all three of them are fairly straightforward when it comes to pronunciation. The tones are a problem. in Chinese, and I think that's where again you need to do a lot of listening for the intonation. And as I've said many times, I found it very useful to listen to these xiangsheng comic dialogues because the comedians exaggerate the intonation, and if you can get the intonation as part of a series of phrases or even pick up on the music of the language, then the tones will slot into place, not 100%, but 60, 70, 80% of the time as you get better at it. As far as understanding the language, I think Chinese probably represents the greatest difficulty in terms of comprehension because there are so many homonyms, and that is words that sound the same but have different meaning, and because different parts of China have different tones and pronounce these words differently, so that the zh sound is z in some places, the sh becomes s, and so all of a sudden there's more homonyms because they aren't distinguishing between the zh and the z and the sh and the s. So Chinese from that perspective is more difficult to understand. I find Japanese quite easy to understand, and Korean, it's too early for me to tell because I'm just getting into it. But I have the sense that there again, there are no tones to deal with in Japanese or Korean, so that makes it easier to pronounce and easier to understand when the language is spoken. One of the problems that I had with Japanese, but to some extent it's true of all languages, is that I remember myself being frustrated that so many of the words sounded the same. Kawarimasu, wakarimasu. And it is a fact that Japanese has fewer sounds in it than most languages. I think it's, of the languages that I've learned, it's the one with the fewest different sounds. So, there's however many sounds, kakiku, keiko times however many. But, so that makes it more difficult at first because the words have a tendency to sound the same. So, difficulty, I still say, I found Russian difficult. I find trying to go from Russian to Czech where it's similar, but there are some different structures. It's always a challenge, and it's just a matter of giving yourself enough time, enough exposure with the language, not getting frustrated when you go to speak and you can't quite get the hang of their structure and you can't remember words. Don't worry about it. If you continue the intensive input, eventually these things will become more natural. The brain will will get used to it. I don't care if you're a Westerner learning an Asian language or an Asian learning a Western language or learning a language from the Amazon or from an Australian Aboriginal language. Our brains will eventually get used to the new patterns, and you just have to expose yourself enough to it. So to that extent, comparing the difficulty level of Chinese, Japanese, I'm not sure that's useful. If you have Chinese and you go to Japanese, you're at a big advantage because you already have the characters, hopefully. If you're a Japanese person, if you're an Asian language speaker, native speaker or otherwise, learning another of the East Asian languages, you have, of course, an advantage. But, the challenges of the language are there, and if you're motivated enough and you commit the time, and if you're flexible, if you don't fight the new structures and find them strange and resist them and so forth, then you will learn them. So, I don't know if that answers the question, but I've talked for about almost 14 minutes on the subject. So, look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.